Thanks for showing up. I'm going to try to make this interesting and exciting for all you guys. I know it's kind of the second day. I don't know about you guys, but I was feeling a little under-caffeinated before I came to this and had to, get that energy back up. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to come out here. So I'm Ben. I'm at Sumo Logic. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we do in a second. But I've been doing this for about 5.5 years at Sumo Logic, and we're going to talk about a couple different things. So what I wanted to do for you guys is we actually made an announcement just a couple days ago about customer experience and how that relates to what we do and what you guys do and how important it is to use machine data, which is basically all that data that's produced by your applications, by your things. So this is like the logs, the performance metrics, everything coming out of Kubernetes and Docker and your custom application logs, how that actually applies to customer experience. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches to using that, and then I want to give you guys some practical examples. So I do want to tell you we are going to get to there's going to be some code on the screen at the end. There's going to be some practical examples at the end, so hold out if that's what you're looking for. So let's get started on that. So where I want to start at, and I think one of the things that I think is always interesting in what we're doing is how we take this deep dive technology that all of us deal with every day and how we tie this to what people out in the real world think about. So how do you explain this to your mom? How do you explain this to your grandma? What do you do every day? So one of those things that I've found that's been really useful for me is talking about customer experience. And that's one of the reasons why this report from 451 was so great for me, because and this was an early report this year from 451 Research, and they asked a bunch of companies, and they said, what's the top driver for software investment? And so they came up with the things you would normally expect, like reducing costs, collaboration, creating new revenue streams. But I thought it was so interesting how customer experience rose to the top. And that has not been the case before. Typically these were more mundane things like reducing costs and increasing revenue streams. And what did that really mean? And so we actually dug in and did another survey with 451, which I'm going to show to you guys. But what I want to do first is I want to walk through and talk a little bit about a theory that I have on this. And you see if this kind of resonates with you, because I think there's something really interesting going on here that not everybody is recognizing. So how I'm going to start talking about that is talking about how customer experience has changed. And talking about what I think that we can all kind of relate to. So if you think about over the last 150 years, there has been this long-term kind of trajectory for what companies have been doing around customer experience. So if we start off with the catalog. So I actually remember when I was a kid, they still had the Sears Roebuck catalog. You'd get that. You'd actually, I'd leaf through it. I thought it was the best thing ever. But when you think about when this actually came out in the late 19th century, you had these houses. They could be on the prairie. And they could be out in the Midwest, on the West Coast, and they could actually literally go in this catalog and order a house. They could order anything they want. And this was revolutionary, right? You didn't have to go down to the grocery down the street and get only the things they could get their hands on. You could actually order from a catalog. And so it increased the access of goods. Now, if you think next, you went to things like shopping centers. So you went, bigger stores, and then you started bringing everything together. You had a mall. This is actually a picture from Berlin. I was just talking about this last week in Berlin, and it's this was a worldwide phenomenon. You get it to more people, get more access. Now, what happened over time, and this is particularly when I was kind of a teenager into college, we transitioned into these big box stores. So like Best Buy, Toys R Us, which is now not doing so great, which is part of what we're going to talk about, and Walmart. And what do? They reduced the cost of distribution and got it to more people, right? Now, if we think about Amazon.com as a perfect example of this, they actually took that to the complete logical extreme. Okay, now we're going to reduce costs as low as absolutely possible. We're going to increase access to everyone 24/7 everywhere. And it kind of reaches peak. Now, the argument I would make to you is I think there is now a sea change in the industry. Because now that's expected. If you are making an application today, it's expected to be 24/7, fully available, really worldwide. And so now we're moving to personalization. So now it doesn't have to only be fully, accessible. It has to be personalized at scale. And I think that's probably what's driving a lot of stuff. I think it's probably the reason driving you guys to be here and driving the technology that we're adopting. So another way to think about it, and I like, graphics. Who here watches Silicon Valley, by the way? You seen the show? Okay, good. So there's a thing on there called the conjoined triangles. Does anybody remember that? So go check it out if you don't. It's actually a website that's disturbingly real. It sounds a lot like a lot of startup companies, but you should go check it out. But I always like that visualization, so I made my own conjoined triangles. So there's really, we were talking about there's two trends here. So driving from high cost to low cost, so decreasing the cost of delivery, and then going from scarcity to ubiquity. Now, what I think that was driving towards on the left was commoditization, driving towards commodity. So if you think of a lot of what Amazon.com has done, and really what containerization is at the end of the day, is about making a commodity out of a component. So you're not worried about, you're basically reducing the cost and reducing the cost of delivery more and more and more, being more productive and doing it in higher volume. Like I said, I think this is switched now. It's switched to experience. So now all that's assumed. It's all assumed that you're going to do it at low cost and you're going to do it at high scale. Now you have to do it always on, personalized, and you have to do it as part of a community. So, and the great thing about this is I think every company that I've ever talked to about this immediately recognizes themselves in that, because companies are either on the right fighting for their lives or they're desperately trying to cross from left to right. So Toys R Us did not cross from left to right, right? There's a lot of, you can come up with all your own companies that companies when I was a kid that did not cross left to right. I don't think companies like Best Buy have really crossed left to right completely yet. They're still moving in that direction. Now to the technology. I think this is driving technology trends. So if we think about now the technology, one trend you're seeing is exactly why we're here. When I started out, I actually learned to program, believe it or not, on a mainframe. And I learned how to program C on a VAX because that's what they had at my school. And that drove to, when I was in college, I learned how to do 3-tier applications. I made, my master's thesis was on a Oracle WebLogic and Solaris web server. That was what the big thing was at the time. That moved to software-oriented architectures and moved to microservices, to containerization, now to IoT and serverless. And bottom line, what is it doing? Is it's making more things more smaller things, which are then driving to scale. Because again, as cool as the technology is, and I love the technology, I'm a self-professed nerd, but the thing is, we didn't do that just because it was fun. This is complicated. It's complicated making that transition and using these different architectures, but the reason why you do it is because you're driving to scale. Because the stuff that they started out when I started out in the early 2000s would not have achieved that scale. Now again, I think there's a dichotomy here. On the traditional side, these were static architectures, centralized, they were large components that were really difficult to scale. So, I've told this story many times. I remember one experience. I actually did consulting for the government, and there was one particular part of the government that I consulted for where a developer pushed out some code and there was 30 days of downtime. And they couldn't pull the code out again, they couldn't upgrade it, they couldn't scale it, everything was broken. And literally for 30 days they slept in the conference room until they fixed it. Now that was an absolute worst case example, but that was the kind of architecture we built on. Now we're moving to these constantly changing distributed small component architectures. Now again, I think this is this chasm that most of us are either trying to stay on the right or we're trying to cross it over. And I don't think it's a static thing, right? So when Sumo Logic started, about 8 years ago, and I joined about 5.5, almost 6 years ago, Docker wasn't really a thing then. It wasn't something that we would have used. And then a couple years in, it was something that we could take advantage of. Kubernetes wasn't a thing a few years ago. Now it's a thing. It's moving very, very quickly. And so we're constantly having to move our architecture from left to right. Now, one interesting thing, and I pulled up one stat because I really wanted to have something in particular for this show. We produced something called the Modern App Report. So one of the great things about having over 2,000 customers, over 50,000 users across the world is now we can gather data from all these customers. And one of the things we've tracked Docker adoption, which we think is going to be somewhere in our user base, probably about 40% this year. But we also have tracked the changing of the technologies that are being used to run Docker. So in this case, we were looking at the comparison between ECS and Kubernetes year to year. So again, this is over just 1 year. You can see that last year, Kubernetes and ECS were neck and neck. And literally, maybe a little hard to tell with the scale, but it's completely reversed now. Now Kubernetes is 60% versus ECS 40%, and I'm guessing if we do this in a couple of months, it'll be even lower. So things are changing really, really fast. They didn't change this fast 10 years ago. So this is the environment we're in, and this is the kind of technologically change that you have to deal with. So this now gets into, so we've kind of talked about that there's this sea change going on in the industry that basically companies are living and dying by what kind of customer experience they deliver, and are they able to do that at scale? So we went out and did this survey with 451. This was just released on Tuesday. You can go to sumologic.com and get it for free. We want people to see the data. And there were some really interesting things that came out of it. And really what came out of it was, in particular this piece, that if you're not competing on customer experience and you're not using analytics to drive that and using your data to drive a better customer experience, you are going to lose. You're going to cease to exist. You're going to be a dinosaur. That's how quickly it's moving. So in one piece that I thought this was, I did not expect this kind of result out of it. So we sent it out. There was about 250 odd customers that actually companies that responded. And these were across the board. So these were not just Silicon Valley companies, New York companies. These were across the US. They were we had government, we had healthcare, we had retail, we had technology. So these are a lot of verticals that do not adopt technology very fast. My brother's in the medical industry and they do not adopt technology fast, right? But still, when we explained to them what machine data is, and so we said this is kind of the exhaust of your applications, this is the data your applications produce, 64% of them said that analyzing that data was extremely important to driving a better customer experience. And another 32% said it was extremely important. So this means over 90% of those companies, which are not just the leading edge companies, about, I think it was 30% of them were over 10,000 people. Even these large, more traditional companies recognized that machine data was absolutely essential to them succeeding in the marketplace. So this is kind of, this is the kind of environment that we're sitting in. So the question then is, okay, why doesn't everybody use this? So why doesn't everybody go and analyze all their data? Because the reality is, and I'm sure some of you guys could see this in your own environments, even if you are kind of on the cutting edge, there's a lot of data that just sits there. I don't know how many conversations I have with different companies like, well, we don't analyze this, we don't have time, we haven't time to look at it. So what is it that's keeping people from doing this? So that was another question that we asked. And we asked, what was your biggest obstacle? So there was a whole bunch of different obstacles, but these came out clearly at the top. Ease of use, real-time access, and advanced analytics. So I'm going to try to give you my perspective on that. And I think this was really interesting to me as well. So number one is the self-service piece. So I think all of you guys can attest is when I started out in IT, you didn't really have a choice in the tool you wanted to use. You just got handed it. And if it was it wasn't a particularly good tool, then it's like, well, that's your problem. Go away. We have other things to do. Now there's an expectation that tools are going to be easier to use. But I don't think that's all of this. So if you think about it now, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, is that I think more people are consuming machine data, looking at stuff brought out of logs and performance metrics, than are out of your typical engineering, your IT ops, your DevOps, your security operations teams. And if you are in customer support, you're in a customer success, or even in marketing and sales, you do not want to go write complicated queries and learn all this stuff. So you want self-service and easy to use, and I think that's the reason why this is top, and I've seen that in conversations. Now the other part is real-time access to data. So I found that one interesting as well. So when I first joined Sumo Logic, I would have conversations with customers and we're like, oh, are you analyzing your data to learn about, how you can drive better customer experience or whatever it was? And like, oh yeah, we put it in a Hadoop cluster. Okay, that's great. So what do you do with that? Well, within a week, we can get answers to the questions we have. I was like, within a week? Really? We're like, oh, that's fine. That's fine for what we do. I don't think that's fine anymore, right? If you are having to win based on customer experience, and you can lose customers in minutes, I know even at Sumo Logic, when we have year-long contracts, we can lose customers in minutes because if somebody has a bad experience, that will then carry over, and they may eventually decide to do something else. Instead of using Sumo Logic. So what this means is you have to be able to respond to issues very, very fast. And how do you do that? You need to have real-time access to data. It is not okay to have data 2, 3, 4 hours late. Now, I think on the engineering and operations side and maybe the security side, this is more well known, but I don't think in the rest of the company that's been known. And I think, again, that's one of the reasons why this is driving so high. Now, the third thing, advanced analytics, is a little bit counterintuitive to me. So they're asking for it to be easy to use, but then be really advanced. And I think the reason why that is that once you dig below the surface is that the people that are experts in data, which a lot of you here may be, is you actually want to be able to get in the guts and do what you want. So you've got this two-part going on. You've got people that have to be able to access the data, and then you've got people that need to be able to do the complicated things to be able to produce the stuff that the other people want. So if somebody in customer success wants to see how their customers are doing, they may not be able to produce those reports, and they're going to go to somebody else to do that. So these people that are data scientists or data experts or in this every day, they want to have all the tools that they can use to produce this data. Okay, so the great thing about this is I think this is kind of where the industry is going, is actually solve these problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how Sumo Logic approaches this. And we'll keep this, just give you a high level. We can go, feel free to come by the booth and ask us. But I give you an idea about how I think you really approach this. And then I want to give you some specific examples like I promised. So the first part is having a, top to bottom view. So again, when you were doing it, if you do this in a traditional application, you're like, okay, well, as long as I have, it's all in my own data center, just install a couple things here and there and I'll be fine. Well, the reality is, I'm sure most of you guys out there, your data is spread, if you think about it, all over the place. Not only are you probably using cloud services, and you're putting it in containerized architectures, you have your own custom code. I'm assuming that most of you have third-party services that you're using to deliver part of your stack, right? So Sumo Logic, we use a different service to deliver our billing. We don't do billing ourselves. We don't want to deal with that. We have a different service that we use for customer relationship management, like Salesforce. We have all these different tools. We use Google Apps. We use all these different things that we use to deliver that. That is all part of the stack. So what that means is that you have to have complete visibility top to bottom. Now the other part of this too is that you have to have all the different types of data out of this. So it's not good enough just to pull log data, unstructured log data. You actually have to have performance metrics, you have to have tracing, whatever you call it, transactions. You have to have all the data, because what do you have to do if you're having to solve a problem for a customer in minutes? You have to have instant access to that data. So we have this full stack of data. Now what do we do with it? Now, I think there's really kind of 3 stages to this, and we'll go through this kind of at a higher level. So first of all, monitoring. Now I actually think this kind of goes across the board. This is an operational and a security posture type of thing. But really here, you're focusing on user impacting issues. So one of the things is, I don't know if many of you guys have read the book, Art of Monitoring out there. Has anybody heard of that book? It's a great book. If you touch monitoring at all, I suggest you read it. And one of the things he says in that book is that typically, what do we monitor? Oh, we go monitor, let me go monitor CPU. Do you think your customer gives a crap about the CPU of your server? No, they don't care. They care about the fact they can't log in. They care about the fact they can't add something to their cart. So why are you monitoring stuff your customers don't care about? And I mean, this is the natural thing to do. I mean, when monitoring tools first started coming out, they were red light, green light, right? So you need to monitor what your users care about. So for example, at Sumo Logic, what do we monitor? We do monitor some system infrastructure issues, but we monitor, can people log in? We monitor what's the delay on the data coming in, because people don't want their data late because of the real-time stuff we talked about. We monitor query performance, which I'm not going to go and talk about in a minute. How long does it take to run a search query? That's the stuff people pay us for. That's the stuff we monitor. And if I'm going to wake up an engineer at 2 a.m., I'm going to wake him up about that stuff. I'm not going to wake her up about something completely different, right? So it's all about having that focus. Now, once you get past this monitoring and you're monitoring stuff that's important to your customers, then you move into this kind of investigate, troubleshoot stage. So here, you really need to now open up the kimono and see all the data, right? So monitoring is all about monitoring a few very important things. If you wake people up at 2 a.m., wake them up about the important stuff. Now when you're investigating, now you have to have complete access to everything. And this is also sometimes where there's a failure here. It's like, well, we don't have, it's 2 a.m., something's broken, and you go investigate it, and it's like, well, I can't actually investigate that because we forgot to put the data in. Again, does your customer care about that? If your CEO asks why the service is still down after 5 hours, does he care that you forgot? He probably will, but maybe you'll be working another job next day, right? So it's all about having all the data. So here, it's about having access to everything so that, again, the subject matter experts that are paid good money to understand their application and are being, put on a pager and have to deal with this stuff, they need to be able to follow their intuition. They need to be able to make a hypothesis and go see if it's true. Now, part of the thing here, if we relate this back to customer experience, I think this is sometimes where it gets lost. Like, how do these relate to customer experience? Well, what I would say is that these maintain customer experience. No matter how well you monitor your systems, your customer experience won't get better. It just doesn't get worse. if you reduce the amount of downtime by doing great investigations, it doesn't get worse, at least, but it also doesn't get better. So I think that's why this third stage is so important, is optimization. And I think this is where a lot of the really cool stuff is happening right now about doing things better. So here is where you actually get to invest in driving better customer experience. This is where, honestly, I would assume that most everybody that does this is actually where you want to spend your time. Nobody likes being woken up or in the middle of the day having to have a stressful outage and having to go deal with that. But what's really interesting is, well, I'm going to go do some work and figure out if there's a way I can make my customers happier. I mean, who doesn't want to do that, right? And I'm going to show you some of those examples. This is where everybody wants to put their time, and this is where you can improve your customer experience. Okay, so this is kind of a simple way of talking about it, and what I want to do is I want to kind of then parlay that into also, one thing before we do that is about the people. So again, we talk a bit about different groups of people getting involved. So one of the things I find most fascinating about this is how these tools can actually, they're kind of like a virus in the organization. They expand out. There's one of my favorite use cases over at Sumo Logic is with Samsung Smart Things. We're actually giving out one of their smart hubs at our booth, and they actually have a number. They said 80 to 90% of their company uses, basically gets value out of Sumo Logic data on a daily basis. Now just think about what that means. This means marketing people, sales people, this means non-technical people are getting value. Now how are they getting value out of it? They're getting value with dashboards, with reports, but that's because basically people have moved from left to right on this diagram, right? So it means that more than just your basic groups are getting access to this data. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. So how can you actually do this in real life? So a couple examples I want to give you now. Because we're here talking about containerization, the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how you can actually get this data in. So my good friend Frank Reno is here. He actually, he's been working on this really hard lately. We actually just announced some improvements we made around this to get in, this data at a very native level. So the important thing here is that you can get, particularly with Docker and Kubernetes, and we'll talk about it in a minute, is you can get in all that data. Now I think one of the cool things about this is that, really how now with these kind of integrated platforms like Kubernetes and Docker, you can actually get these fat pipes of data, and with a couple, pretty simple, straightforward process, and then be able to use that everywhere. So in this case, for example, using a couple of things like FluentD and Prometheus, you're actually getting that data pulled out of the platform, whether it's on EKS or it's your own installed Kubernetes or an AKS or wherever it is, and you're pulling in all that data and you suck that all into Sumo Logic. Okay, and in this case, then you can analyze or cross that. Now, once you do that, why do we all do that? Because we basically get, we get insight into Kubernetes. So in this case, this is giving you a bunch of stats about how Kubernetes is running and what's going on in Kubernetes. Now, again, this is the beautiful thing about this is you're not having to install 1,000 different agents and collectors. You can get this set up really quickly. And the great thing too is you can get it wherever it runs. So the reality is one of the things I think is most interesting about Kubernetes in particular, and kind of Docker and more generally, is that it's enabling kind of multi-cloud strategy. So it's something we could probably spend a whole different talk on. But because now you can run Kubernetes on any platform, any of these cloud platforms, you can now potentially have a multi-cloud strategy that works really well. So in this case, Google Cloud, Amazon EKS, you're getting the same data. Now the great thing is on Docker, we actually just released some updates to Docker, and in here you're getting insights into the whole Docker stack with native integrations. Now the important thing I would say here, it's not necessarily obvious from looking at it, but these are not just machine logs, infrastructure logs, Docker logs. These are actually both performance metrics and logs together integrated in one platform. And that's really important because, again, when you're trying to solve something at 2 a.m., you don't want to say, oh, well, it's taking really long to investigate this issue because, oops, it's actually stored as a log, not a metric, and it takes really long to run. So this is all about performance and getting data optimized at what you're trying to do. Now, this is kind of the typical stuff. This is the building blocks that you understand. When you have a Kubernetes issue, you have a Docker issue, can I go in and solve it? Now, like I was talking about before, that's not really where your customers are going to care. So I wanted to give you one example about how you can take a piece of data and you can use it in a lot of different ways. So at Sumo Logic for years now, we have had this query activity log. So basically every time a customer runs a query, we don't care about what data they're running it on. We take basically the metadata about the search they ran, and we stored it so we can look if did it run slow for them, what kind of commands did they use. And so basically it's this big JSON object. And I cut, out the details to save the innocent and some of the stuff that it would literally take like 10 slides to show everything. But this gives you an idea of what's there. Now, once I have this, now what can I do with it? So one of the first things you can potentially do with this is do query execution time. So this is the most obvious thing. We've been doing it for years. So for example, I told you that our customers pay us to have really good query execution times, and they're not very happy with us if it takes 10 times as long to run a query. So what we do is I think we look at the 95th percentile of all the queries, and then we make sure that it doesn't go over a certain SLO internally, and then if it is, then we go investigate it. But in this case, what I'm doing is I'm basically extracting the JSON, I'm pulling out the execution query time, and then I'm putting that on a histogram. So now I can run this into alerting, and I can, for example, look for outliers and anomalies in this. Did it, increase really quickly? Did I see one particular customer taking a lot longer to run? Like one of the things we'll do is we'll look at it overall, because we might know that, maybe our Frankfurt instance is running slower than our Sydney instance. Why? But it can also say that, okay, well, customer X running in Dublin just had a huge spike in query execution time. Why? So we might actually send somebody to investigate that. So we can kind of split and dice this however we want. Now, where I think this gets kind of interesting is then how would I actually correlate that with something that's actually happening on the machine? So one thing I did here is said, okay, so like I told you before, no customer cares if your CPU is high. But at the end of the day, if you're investigating an issue, you may care. So in this case, what I did is I said, okay, let's take and look at the CPU on the search head. So these are actually the machines that take in the search query that you're running, and then they go run it, and they go do their MapReduce function, they go grab the data, and they bring it back. And what I did then is I mapped the number of queries against that CPU. Now, again, this is probably fairly obvious in retrospect, but there's a high correlation between the number of queries you're running and the CPU that's running. Now, in this case, this tells me that my search heads are CPU bound, as opposed to memory bound. But you can do this with anything, right? Because now I could say, oh, am I seeing a large number of errors that are directly proportional to memory? Maybe there's an out-of-memory error. Or I'm seeing, I'm seeing CPU spike at the same time that something else is going on. So again, this correlation is a extremely important way to kind of zero in on these problems. Now, what I did for the most of the time, my time at Sumo Logic is I was a product manager. So I would be responsible for, driving a, particular feature out the door, and then I would have to then, check to make sure that customers were being trained, and, were they adopting it. Now, one case, there's one feature that we have at Sumo Logic is called log reduce. So it's kind of where we have a patent around it, and it uses machine learning to do pattern analysis on logs and organize them into patterns, so you don't have to look at thousands of logs. You can look at 4 or 5 different patterns. But we decided to make some updates to it so people could do additional analysis on it. So I was really excited about it, and I wanted to push it out. But what I realized is I wanted to try experiment. So I don't know if anybody else has used a product called Intercom out there. It's a really cool product that you've probably seen a lot of websites, you may even know it's there. And it allows you to do announcements and reach out to customers. So what I wanted to find is, I want to see if that would actually be an effective way to communicate with our customers. So what I did is I looked for this particular usage. And then here, what you'll see is that in the beginning, at the very far left of the graph is when I released it. So I released it without any fanfare, and I just want to see if people picked up on it. Not surprisingly, they really didn't. And then what I said, now I'm going to do an announcement to a specific subset of customers, and I'm going to announce it through Intercom. And then literally, it's about 2-3 orders of magnitude more people use it, and then it maintains over time. Now, what was I able to do with this? And this, we do a lot more analysis than this, and I'll show you something in a second that I did a little bit more complicated than this. But what I was able to do with a very simple query here is I was able to show that, number one, I was able to show the uptake of this particular feature and that it had good uptake. But what I was also able to show is that this particular product that we could use inside of Sumo Logic, Intercom, was highly effective at getting our customers to adopt new functionalities and get value out of it. And I could literally walk up to the VP of product and say, hey, this is basically your business case to do this. And we did a lot more like this, right? So again, same data. So this is exact same log data we're looking at before. Now the great thing is you can do a lot more complicated ones. So in this case, last year partly because we were, that ease of use, thing I was talking about, that's feedback we've been getting for a long time. We're a pretty technical tool, but we wanted to invest time to make it easier for people to consume. So we completely reworked the UI, which I would assume most everybody out there knows there was no easy feat. It was a lot of work. And, but it allowed us to introduce some new features. So I tried to pick one example out of this that I didn't think would, reveal any customer data or anything like that. So in this case, this is actually a new tab that we introduced. So one of the things we tried to do is like, okay, let's introduce this Learn tab. So there's going to be a Learn tab, and we're not going to like broadcast it. We're going to see if people can find it, and we want to know where they click. So in this case, this is a larger subset of logs. But here we looked at how many people are visiting, are they clicking, what percentage are clicking, where are they clicking, and where are they going after they click. And this goes, if we tie that back to what Samsung SmartThings said and some of those things I was saying before, we put this up on a big screen. So we have this big TV over by the product area, and the customer success one has, and the operations team have. We put dashboards like this and similar ones up in our screen. But why do we do that? Because people walk by and they're actually able to say, it's like, okay, well the product team said they're doing this new big feature release, and then we put this on the screen, and they're like, oh, okay, well I see it's being adopted. I can see the customers are using this, and we're being transparent and opening up the kimono. But we also use this in product meetings. So when we go into a product meeting, we would actually have to bring dashboards, and we put them inside a presentation, and we have to show the adoption. Now, one thing to point out here that is really important, so how do you actually achieve this after the fact? Well, the thing that you'll run into is, what if I want a great dashboard like this, but I didn't think about it beforehand? And then afterwards, I'm like, oh crap, we forgot to instrument that particular action, or we forgot, and I've definitely done that before. So one of the things we started doing as part of this, and is we actually, as part of every feature that we release, part of the epics or the user stories is the definition of the machine data that has to be produced. So basically logs and metrics that have to be produced by the engineers. And that way we know, because we say we want this kind of dashboard, what do you have to do to produce it? So you have to think ahead of time to do that. Now, one of the fun things too is it doesn't have to be just IT feature data. So just to prove that I could still code, I decided I wanted to do a fun project. So what I did is we introduced this new API for sending in data that could send both unstructured log data and structured performance metrics data. And I had always been interested in weather data, so I said, what if I write a function that will actually go integrate with the Open Weather API? It'll pull down all the data, and then it'll put it into a dashboard. And this is actually a dashboard that is running right now. And so what I did is it goes and it actually then maps some temperatures across the world. It, the forecast, those are in logs, those are in unstructured data that we can map out. And then, I'm looking at temperature, humidity, wind speed, all these different types of things. And I should have actually put it on here. One thing I created, we have a big India office, and I created this one graph that shows, I call it the, it's in this town called Noida outside of India, and we have the Noida temperature index to show how much hotter it is than Redwood City, California. It's usually at least 50 to 100% hotter, but we put that up on the screen. But again, it's kind of, but the thing is that to me this demonstrates the kind of data that you can bring into the tool. And actually, another one of my friends here, Kenneth, he actually instrumented a game and pulled a dashboard on the game. So there's all sorts of cool stuff you can pull in. So again, to kind of wrap up, this is more about what we do. But I think everything that we've been talking about, the important part of really trying to achieve these use cases is having the kind of solution and product that will allow you to pull in all that data from all these different places. And I think, come by, we can talk to you in more detail and show you some stuff, but it's really about being able to deal with those kind of wide-ranging types of data and pull that all together in one place. Now, just kind of what I want you to take away. So, first of all, that customer experience is the imperative. I think, I've been an engineer for a long time. There's a tendency to get so deep in the technology and so deep in the weeds that we forget that we're actually serving a customer. Is that the reason why we exist and we make money is because there's some customer out there that we're hopefully giving joy to and they love the product. But I think more than now, that is why you live or die in today's environment. And what the statement I make to you is I think machine data analytics, pulling out that exhaust out of your application, that's the secret sauce by monitoring, investigating, and optimization. And knowing that one piece of data, and this is the wonderful thing about this, there's usually diamonds in the rough that are buried inside your data, is that one piece of data can produce all these different insights that you can use across the company. Okay, so one thing now in a shameless plug, one of the things we've doing at Sumo Logic is we started up a new podcast that's been actually a lot of fun. It's basically an elaborate excuse for me to talk to really interesting people. So one of the things too is I encourage you guys to, it's called Masters of Data. You can go to mastersofdata.com. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up here is because I specifically timed one release this week. I don't know who here has heard of Jez Humble, of Gene Kim, Nicole Forsgren. So they work at a place called DevOps Research and Analytics. They put out these really cool reports called State of DevOps. It used to be sponsored by Puppet. So I interviewed them this week. And if you're interested at all about how to, how you can run a really effective organization from a DevOps perspective, they basically go through all of it. And it was a huge learning experience for me. And I definitely suggest you check it out. And I've got some other cool guests coming up. So with that, thank you. I think if there are any questions, we probably have a couple minutes to do that. I think we have probably 3 minutes. But thank you for your time. Appreciate it.